I'm a little perplexed, folks, by who we've got on here. I think maybe he is the midnight policy wonk. Let's show him up on the screen. I was looking for Joshua Sharf, but maybe because he's following strict social distancing requirements, the senior fellow at the Independence Institute doesn't seem to be on. Or what's going on? Hello, Joshua, is that you?
It is indeed. Good morning, Jimmy. I just I don't want to give anybody any reason whatsoever to call one of those snitch lines. So here I am, black hatted and black masked and ready to, I guess, ready to rob the federal treasury or something.
Well, that does seem to be going on quite a bit right now, although more you could probably rob the Federal Reserve. They've got trillions that they're giving out, Joshua.
It appears, yeah, they can just like with the click of their enter key, they can just make money. It's a magical thing, isn't it?
I will have to tell you, though, I don't think anybody's going to snitch on you. You are home and you are
No,
on
that's
via webcam. We're not actually doing
no.
an in-person interview, so you don't have to. You could keep the hat on. I mean, that works
Yeah,
too.
that's
But
all right. We'll make
however,
it safe.
however you would like to do it. Good to see you, my friend. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How you doing? You're getting the band back together.
Yeah, yeah. We have. I used to host a morning show in Denver called Business for Breakfast, and coming up in the next segment's Woody Vincent. We've got Joshua Sharf here today, and both of them were regulars for like a couple of years on Mondays on Business for Breakfast. So it's always a treat to have you on the program. How are you doing amidst this current pandemic, especially with a new baby that you have in the house?
Yeah, we've been very lucky that I work at home, and I work as a web developer for a fairly large trucking company. So I've been very fortunate in that I'm not one of the people who has been laid off as a result of this, the shutdown, and so the forced shutdowns and so forth. And yet, despite the fact that I still have a job, I'm been agitating somewhat for the idea that it's the job of the people who want to shut things down to prove that it actually does some good. And so I'm not happy about how all this is going. And however, the baby is obviously happy. David is he was born about 7 months ago, and both mom and dad have been home the whole time, and so it's great for us. And obviously, he likes having both of us around.
I'm sure. Hey, so let me ask you a question. You're a very smart guy. You understand public policy, economics, a variety of different issue areas, foreign policy as well. You just said you're not, it seems, particularly convinced that the policies that have been in place, these shutdown policies, have actually been working. Why not? Because we're hearing
Well,
you got to keep them going.
yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't lump them all together. I mean,
Yeah,
I make fun with the bandana here, but there is some evidence that masks are helpful. There
sure.
is some evidence that staying away, at least some level of distancing is helpful. There is clearly evidence that doing things like washing your hands is good. I joked at the beginning when social distancing and washing hands were the two big things that they were telling people to do, that the Midwest was pretty much already corona proof then, right? But I felt that those things make sense. But when it becomes so much more restrictive, and when you end up making people shop in the same place when they might be going to different stores, but the other stores are closed, when they could handle social distancing, when they could handle keeping people some distance apart, you have the potential to make things worse rather than better if you have everyone going to the same store because other stores aren't open. I think that it's so. I'm not sure we have quite the quantitative level that we need, the quantitative level of evidence that certain specific actions that we have taken are justified,
Hmm,
and I think they're doing a lot of damage,
sure.
and I would just assume get people back to work as soon as we can.
Joshua Sharf, Senior Fellow at the Independence Institute. Your area of specialty is on public sector pensions. Now, Independence Institute is a Colorado based think tank, but you study and compare with all sorts of different public pension programs across the country. And that really, I think, is what undergirds the discussion we'll have in a few moments about the idea of the possibility that states will could be allowed to declare bankruptcy right now. They're not able to, as well as the prospect of bailing them out or maybe just doing nothing, because really what we've seen more than anything have been public sector pension issues that have brought a lot of economic difficulties, financial woes to various states, Illinois being a prime example, as well as New York, New Jersey, among others. I mean, just about every state, it seems, has some sort of pension issues, but some greater than others. And so before we get into the discussion about bankruptcy and bailouts and that sort of thing, since this is really one of the big undergirding factors to the strife that these states are facing financially, give us a little bit of a primer on the public sector pension system and what we've broadly speaking been seeing as far as many of these concerns over those pensions.
Sure. And what's happened basically is that the last stand of the old pension plan that it used to be that some significant fraction, although never a majority, but some significant fraction of employees had pensions rather than 401ks, rather than money that you would put aside and invest directly. They had pensions, and so what you had was a promise that after you retired, after a certain number of years, you would get an annuity. In effect, you would get a certain amount of money each month or each every couple of weeks, and that might or might not be adjusted for inflation, but that was a guarantee on the part of the company, or in the case that we're talking about now, on the part of the states. So you got this promise that you would have this money in perpetuity. And of course, most of those have been replaced by what we know now as 401ks, or defined contribution plans, as opposed to the traditional pension, which is called a defined benefit plan. It's right there in the name. You define the contribution, and then whatever you have at the end is when you retire. Plus, obviously, you can continue to earn earnings on what you have in there, but that's what you have when you retire. And the defined benefit was that you would be given a promise, and that was a benefit that you would get. So that's the difference. What's happened over time is that public pensions, partly in order to, I wouldn't quite say to buy votes, that's probably a little bit strong, but in response to political pressure from the public unions, which can be very powerful in some states, the legislature, or in some cases just the executive, have made excessive promises. And so what happens is when you look on the balance sheet, you have promises far in excess of the assets that you have necessary to cover those promises. So here in Colorado, we estimate that Colorado would say, PERA would say, the Public Employee Retirement Association would say that it's a little bit higher than this. We would estimate that it's around 33% funded, meaning that for every dollar of promises they have made in 2020 dollars, they have about 33 cents to cover it. In Illinois, it's much lower, and Illinois is a more populous state, so they have an even bigger problem. New York and New Jersey have also worked themselves into a corner this way, where they simply have made promises that they don't have the assets to be able to cover.
Now, one thing that I have heard, so I was watching an interview last week with David Sirota, who of course was a senior advisor or member of the Bernie Sanders campaign for president that was unsuccessful. So I think he was the communications director or some such position. And in this interview I watched, he was saying that states had not been properly funding their pensions, and therefore, and we'll get to the bailouts in a moment, but therefore states should be bailed out because they weren't properly funding sufficiently, and there were various reasons for that. But basically saying we weren't giving enough, states weren't giving enough to public sector pensions. Would you say that's a particular issue, that we should be funding them more?
Well, it depends, as with many things. In some cases, I mean, there is this idea, it's an accounting idea, and it's real, called the actuarially required contribution. So that's if you want to put money in based on what you think the returns will be, based on what you think the risk is, and based on obviously what promises you've made, you have a required contribution that you make. And most states have been falling short of that actuarially required contribution. So he's correct in the sense that they haven't been meeting that ARC obligation. All right, that's fine. The question is, why is that? Are they not meeting it because the promises, and this is frequently the case, the promises are simply too extravagant? It always looks appealing to say, well, we just won't make that 10 million or 100 million or $200 million contribution this year, but we're talking about a $30 billion pension plan, so it's really not such a big deal. We'll make it up in future years. And that, of course, just never happens. So have they made promises that are now that if they fully funded them would crowd out other spending that they want to do. Well, that suggests that maybe the promises are a little bit are more than they can afford, and probably shouldn't have been made. So there are always two sides to that.
So right now we're seeing states like Illinois and New York in very strenuous situations, circumstances as far as their financial state of affairs, hence getting into this bailout versus bankruptcy discussion. And again, before we get to that, one last question or topic that I want to hit on kind of leading up to it is, to what extent is what we're seeing in these other states right now in terms of their financial woes a result of the public pension crisis versus specifically COVID-19 and coronavirus? In other words, the comorbidity that we've been seeing talked about in terms of how certain deaths may be counted towards the coronavirus total. How would you assess and sort of balance out the public pension issue that might be bringing about these crises and why these states are asking for bailouts or suggesting that maybe a bailout will be necessary, versus coronavirus itself being the issue?
Yeah, that's a great analogy, and I'm going to steal it without attribution.
Go for it.
I think there's I think there's a real that's a real good point, that a lot of these states basically back themselves into a corner, and so when something like this hits, they have no margin for error. It's years, decades worth of poor choices that are finally catching up with them when an unexpected, although inevitably we were going to have some sort of recession. These things are always unexpected, by the way. And if you look at and it just, people are lousy at making predictions. So if you go back just very quickly, and you look at the predictions that the state agencies that are responsible for predicting what's going to happen in terms of the next year's income when they're looking, or next year's tax revenue, they're always wrong whenever a recession hits. It's always a surprise. And so in this case, of course, we can argue that the virus itself was a bit of a surprise, and that the federal, not the federal, but the mostly gubernatorial shutdowns have been were unexpected. But they never get this stuff right. So, it's decades worth of mismanagement that's finally catching up. I think it was, the saying, how do you go bankrupt? Well, a little bit at a time and then all at once.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. All right, let's play Mitch McConnell. So this is last week. These were comments he made with Hugh Hewitt. So there's video here, a little mismatch between the audio video from Hugh Hewitt's show. But let's go ahead and play it where you can hear Hugh Hewitt's question and then the answer from the Senate Majority Leader that has rankled a lot of people, ruffled quite a bit of feathers when it comes to this question of bankruptcy versus the notion of bailouts. And then in a moment, we'll play the response from Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York.
Agree. I think people do not understand how badly mismanaged some states have been and their unfunded liabilities. And if they were in the private sector, they would have to reorganize under the bankruptcy code. But there is no bankruptcy code chapter. Do you think that we need to invent one for states so that they can discharge some of these liabilities that were put in place by previous governors? Jerry Brown ran a giveaway program for public employee unions that was just astonishing, and as did Gray Davis, as did, it's just a lot of Democratic governors. Illinois is probably the worst, in Connecticut. They've just given money away for years to people who aren't working.
Yeah, I would certainly be in favor of allowing states to use the bankruptcy route. It saves some cities, and there's no good reason for it not to be available. My guess is their first choice would be for the federal government to borrow money from future generations to send it down to them now so they don't have to do that. That's not something I'm going to be in favor of.
Just a quick side note, I hope Senator McConnell might feel the same way about restoring bankruptcy for college debt as well, student loan debt, but that's neither here nor there, very separate issue. Let's also play Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York, specifically asked about this, and I think he said one of the dumbest things of all time. Take a listen.
That's how you're going to bring this national economy back? By states declaring bankruptcy? You want to see that market fall through the cellar? Let New York State declare bankruptcy. Let Michigan declare bankruptcy. Let Illinois declare bankruptcy. Let California declare bankruptcy. You will see a collapse of this national economy. So just dumb. vicious is saying, when Senator McConnell said, this is a blue state bailout. What he's saying is, if you look at the states that have coronavirus problems, they tend to be Democratic states. New York, California, Michigan, Illinois, they are Democratic states. So if you fund states that are suffering from the coronavirus, they're Democratic states. Don't help New York State because it is a Democratic state. How ugly.
Okay, Joshua Sharf, there's a lot there. Two different things, McConnell's statement, and then also Andrew Cuomo basically saying, oh, he's just targeting blue states. By the way, blue states are the ones that have happen to have been having these public pension crises the most because they're the ones who've been unwilling to, it seems, address the issues appropriately. But please, go ahead, senior fellow at the Independence Institute.
Right. So that's so obviously what's happening is Cuomo very deftly changed the subject, is what
Yes.
he did. It doesn't have anything to do with who's getting hit by the virus. It has to, although frankly, his state is responsible for something like 1/3 of the national total of deaths, and it has to do with the fact that New York City is extremely dense and extremely reliant on public transportation. That's at least the going thesis. Of course, it also doesn't help that he himself is putting sick people back into nursing homes, COVID-19 positive people back into nursing homes. But it has nothing to do with who's being hit by the virus. It has everything to do with the bailout. It has everything to do with who's mismanaged their finances for decades. And so there are really three options here. And when we talk about allowing states to use the bankruptcy code, that would require a change in the law. States right now are not legally able to declare bankruptcy. But so if you look at the three options, one is basically to do nothing and kind of let things go as they are. The other would be to bail states out, cut them a check, and say, well, here we're gonna help fund your pensions, either on a pay-as-you-go basis for a little period of time, or we're going to help make good these unfunded liabilities that you've accumulated, or you allow them to use the bankruptcy law. So doing nothing well, of course, a bailout is basically a moral hazard, right? Bailout says, well, we're gonna make the people of let's pick a state that does a good job. Let's say Utah does a reasonably good job of funding their pensions, or we'll pick the states that have been more responsible and less profligate. Pick up the tab for the mistakes that Illinois has made over the years, or the mistakes that New Jersey or New York has made over the years. That doesn't seem particularly fair either, does it? I mean, that's I didn't have a hand in contracting that debt. I shouldn't be asked to pay for it. That's New York's problem. That's so a bailout is not only morally problematic, it creates what's called a moral hazard. Which is next time this happens, they're gonna have their hand back in your pocket.
Right.
The other possibility is to do nothing, and that results in essence a soft default, because what will happen is places like Illinois, and this happened in Illinois a couple of years ago, by the way, they were using IOUs to pay contractors because they couldn't reach a budget agreement in part because pension spending was crowding out so much other spending. They couldn't reach a budget agreement. They couldn't reach a tax package. And they were eventually told by the courts they couldn't make the pension cuts that they wanted to make. So what you had was them issuing IOUs to pay contractors. That's a default. It's not a declared default, but it in effect is what a default looks like, what a soft default looks like. Okay. And eventually you will see, of course, Illinois has a specific problem because it's written into the state constitution that they have to pay these particular benefits. Other states would find other ways of either not paying them, cutting benefits, or simply simply not paying these at some level. So that's what you'll have is a soft default, like it or not. The benefit of using the bankruptcy code is that you state it up front. You say, listen, here is the risk involved. We're going to use the opportunity to go to courts, get these finances in order, reorganize them, and eventually, when states have to go to borrow, they don't necessarily borrow to fund pensions, although some do. But when states go to borrow, now the possibility of bankruptcy will be explicitly stated, as opposed to sort of implicitly,
Now-
sort of pushed to the side, and they will have to pay higher interest rates to borrow, which means that the cost will be factored into that. It'll be a more realistic cost
But
of borrowing. for these
Joshua,
states.
real quick, because we're running over time now at this point, but I want to ask you real quickly. There are those who were saying that a bankruptcy reorganization for these states would basically be a backdoor way for Republicans to get rid of public sector pensions. How do you respond to that?
I mean, it's probably unlikely. I mean, there's still pressure in these states. There's still pressure to have them there. I think if it's a backdoor way to make them behave more responsibly, that would be good.
Sure.
And obviously, my personal preference is to replace these things with defined contribution plans. But I think that I don't think that that's the real intent. By the way, historically, and this is a long time ago, but back in the 1840s, we had a wave of state bankruptcies, and eventually everyone got paid. Most of these were foreign debt holders at that point. They were funding infrastructure, railroads or canals, that sort of thing, for the most part. And eventually, they all got paid. So bankruptcy doesn't mean that the people don't get paid. It means that you have an orderly process for figuring out what's going to go on with the finances.
Final question, unrelated, and I really appreciate your insights, Senior Fellow at the Independence Institute, Joshua Sharf. Today is the 72nd anniversary of the current incarnation of the Jewish state of Israel. Your thoughts?
It's been a low-key celebration. Israel has been on a tighter lockdown even than the United States, although that is now starting to be relaxed a little bit. But it is like you say, the 72nd anniversary, and hopefully many, many, many more.
And what do you make? Have you been following the controversy surrounding Mayor Bill de Blasio of New York City and the comments that he made? Have you followed that at all?
Yeah, I think first of all,
About Jews?
the gathering that he was referring to, this funeral that he was referring to, with a large number of, by the way, almost all of them wearing masks out in public, a large number of Jews out in of the Jewish community in Crown Heights, I think it was organized by the NYPD. It was organized and coordinated with the New York Police Department. So he basically made a statement saying, well, the Jewish community needs to get its act together. And I would just suggest that if you substitute basically any other religious or ethnic group for that, it would be unacceptable, and that sort of talk should be unacceptable in this case.
And he's apologized today in a 2-paragraph statement or something. So really quite something. Joshua Sharf, my friend, always great to check in with you, Senior Fellow at the Independence Institute. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
Thank you as well. Once again, Joshua Sharf joining us today. You just watched a clip from Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel today. You want to catch our live show. And I love your support.
I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah.